The skeletal hands of the office clock crept toward 11:45 p.m. On the 42nd floor of the Vanguard Tower, the only sounds were the low, rhythmic hum of the HVAC system and the sharp whip of a microfiber cloth cutting across a glass desk. Arthur Pendleton exhaled, a sound like dry autumn leaves scraping against pavement. He straightened his back, a brief and painful luxury, and listened to the satisfying pop of his lower vertebrae. At 42, his body felt 60. 10 years of hauling industrial mop buckets and scrubbing the corporate grime of Manhattan's elite will do that to a man. He looked down at the desk he had just polished. It belonged to Julian Vance, the CEO of Vance Global, a billionaire whose net worth had more digits than Arthur's phone number. The mahogany surface was so pristine, it mirrored the fluorescent lights above like a dark, still lake. But Arthur wasn't looking at his reflection. He was looking at the manila folder resting exactly 3 inches from the top right corner of the desk blotter. On the tab, written in Arthur's neat, architectural block lettering, a remnant of a life before the bankruptcy and the hospital bills, were the words, Operational Efficiency Report, Southern Logistics Region. Arthur's heart did a strange, fluttering dance against his ribs. It was a terrifying mixture of hope and profound dread. "Daddy?" The small, raspy voice broke the silence of the executive suite. Arthur's face instantly softened, the deep lines around his eyes crinkling as he turned. Sitting in one of the $4,000 ergonomic leather visitor chairs, her legs dangling nowhere near the floor, was his 7-year-old daughter, Lily. She was wearing an oversized hoodie that smelled like Arthur's laundry detergent, her curls pulled into a messy ponytail. In her lap was a coloring book, but her eyes were heavy, rimmed with the dark circles of a child who spent her nights sleeping on transit buses and office carpets. "Hey, sweetheart," Arthur said softly, his voice dropping into a comforting, gravelly baritone. "I thought you were asleep." The vacuum made a funny noise, Lily murmured, rubbing her nose. "Are we almost done?" "My tummy is doing the rumble thing." Arthur's chest tightened. The rumble thing meant the single slice of cheese and bread he'd scraped together at 5 p.m. had burned off. He checked his pocket. $4.60. Enough for a sleeve of bagels from the 24-hour bodega down the block. But not enough for the cream cheese. "Just a few more minutes, lil bug," Arthur said, walking over and gently brushing a stray curl from her forehead. "Just have to empty the main bins and then we can go get a midnight snack." "I promise." "Okay," she whispered, leaning her head against the leather armrest, her eyes already fluttering shut again. Arthur looked back at the manila folder. Inside that folder wasn't just paper. It was 3 months of sleepless nights, compiled from discarded carbon copies, internal memos found in shredder bins, and Arthur's own degree in supply chain management, a degree that had been rendered useless a decade ago when his wife's terminal illness wiped out their savings, their credit, and eventually his career. He had noticed a massive, systemic bleeding of capital in Vance Global's shipping manifests while emptying the recycling bins of the logistics VP. A routing error, likely a legacy software glitch, was causing double billing on empty shipping containers in the southern ports. It was costing the company $14 million a quarter. Arthur had mapped out the fix, a simple script rewrite and a reallocation of 3 regional hubs, on the backs of discarded graph paper. It was a masterpiece of corporate efficiency, buried in a janitor's handwriting. Suddenly, the heavy glass doors of the executive suite swung open with a sharp click. Arthur froze. Lily didn't wake, but she stirred, curling tighter into her hoodie. A man strode into the room, radiating an aura of intense, aggressive energy. Julian Vance looked exactly like his photos in Forbes, though less manicured and more lethal in person. His Tom Ford suit jacket was unbuttoned, his silk tie loosened by an inch, and his jaw was set in a hard, angry line. He was on a Bluetooth earpiece, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "I don't care what the board says." "Marcus," Julian snapped, pacing behind his desk, completely ignoring Arthur's presence as if the janitor were merely an extension of the vacuum cleaner. "If the southern region doesn't show a turnaround by the opening bell tomorrow, I'm firing the entire regional executive tier. I want solutions, not excuses." Julian slammed his briefcase onto the couch, disconnected the call with a brutal tap to his ear, and let out a long, ragged breath. He pinched the bridge of his nose, the weight of a multi-billion-dollar empire visibly crushing his shoulders. Arthur stood rooted to the spot, holding his microfiber cloth. He knew he should leave, Rule number 1 of the night shift, be invisible. But the folder was sitting right there. And Lily was sleeping right there. And the $4.60 in his pocket felt like hot coals against his thigh. Mr. Vance? Arthur's voice broke the silence. Julian's hand froze on his nose. He slowly raised his head, his piercing gray eyes locking onto Arthur with a mixture of irritation and utter disbelief. It was the look a king might give a peasant who had dared to touch his robe. Who are you? Julian asked, his voice dangerously quiet. And why are you still in my office? I'm Arthur, sir. The night shift custodian, Arthur said, keeping his hands visible and his voice steady, though his knees felt like water. I apologize for the intrusion. I was just finishing up. Then finish and leave, Julian said, turning away to open a drawer in his desk. Sir, if I could just take 30 seconds of your time, Arthur pressed on, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The southern region. I heard you speaking on the phone. Julian stopped. He slowly closed the drawer and leaned both hands on the mahogany desk, staring at Arthur. A cold, mocking smile touched the corner of his lips. You heard me speaking on the phone. And let me guess, you have some thoughts on global supply chain logistics? Yes, sir, Arthur said simply. Julian let out a short, sharp laugh, a sound devoid of any real mirth. The arrogance of this city never ceases to amaze me. I pay McKinsey and Boston Consulting Group $5 million a year to analyze my infrastructure, and the man who empties my wastebasket thinks he has the answer. They missed the legacy software loop in the Savannah Port Registry. Sir, Arthur said, his voice rising with a sudden, desperate confidence. The containers are being logged as in transit when they are actually sitting in dead storage. You're paying demurrage fees on empty steel boxes. It's all in the folder right there. Arthur pointed a trembling finger at the manila folder. Julian looked down at the folder. He picked it up by the corner, using 2 fingers as if it were contaminated. He flipped it open. His eyes skimmed the first page. Handwritten charts, meticulously drawn diagrams, and neatly typed paragraphs from an old mechanical typewriter. A look of profound disgust crossed the billionaire's face. Handwritten garbage, Julian muttered. You expect me to read a middle school science project? It's not garbage, sir, Arthur said, his voice cracking. It's $14 million a quarter. If you just look at page 3, Arthur, Julian interrupted, his voice dropping into a chillingly calm register. Do you know what I value most in my employees? It isn't ambition. It isn't creativity. It is boundaries. You are paid to keep this floor clean. You are not paid to think. When you try to think, you waste my time. Julian looked Arthur dead in the eye. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he crumpled the manila folder in his massive hand, bending the thick cardboard into a ruined mass. He swung his arm out and dropped it. The folder fell into the black mesh wastebasket with a hollow thud. Your shift is over, Julian said coldly. Take your things and get out. If I see you on this floor tomorrow, you're fired. Arthur felt the blood drain from his face. The humiliation was hot and thick, rising in his throat like bile. He looked at the trash can. 3 months of his life. 3 months of skipping sleep, of holding a flashlight between his teeth while Lily slept in the corner. All reduced to crumpled garbage because he wore a gray uniform instead of a tailored suit. Daddy? The small voice cut through the tension like a razor. Julian blinked, his eyes darting to the leather visitor chair. He hadn't noticed the small girl huddled in the oversized hoodie. Lily was rubbing her eyes, looking fearfully between her father and the angry man behind the desk. Arthur didn't say another word to Julian. He walked over to Lily, picked her up in his arms, and let her bury her face in his neck. He grabbed his janitorial cart with one hand, his knuckles white. I'm sorry to have bothered you, Mr. Vance, Arthur said, his voice completely devoid of emotion. Good night. Arthur wheeled the cart out of the office, the squeak of the wheel sounding like a funeral wail in the empty corridor. Behind the desk, Julian Vance stood motionless. He watched the door click shut. The silence of the office rushed back in, but it felt different now, heavier, suffocating. He looked at the visitor chair where the little girl had been sleeping, then slowly lowered his gaze to the wastebasket. The crumpled manila folder peeked out over the rim. Julian scoffed, turning back to his computer. He had a board meeting in 9 hours. He didn't have time for the delusions of a night cleaner. He opened his spreadsheet, staring at the sea of red numbers dominating the southern region profile. Loss, $14.2 million. Root cause unknown. Julian's fingers hovered over the keyboard. The legacy software loop in the Savannah port registry. The janitor's voice echoed in his head. The containers are being logged as in transit when they are actually sitting in dead storage. Julian closed his eyes. He was a ruthless man, a cold man, but he wasn't a stupid man. You don't build a $20 billion empire by ignoring anomalies. And the anomaly here wasn't the numbers. It was the absolute certainty in the custodian's voice. With a frustrated curse, Julian reached down into the wastebasket and pulled out the crumpled folder. He smoothed it out on his desk, flattening the bent cardboard with his palm. He turned to page 3. 5 minutes passed. The anger on Julian's face faded, replaced by a tense, hyper-focused stillness. 10 minutes passed. Julian stood up, walking to his floor-to-ceiling window, staring out at the Manhattan skyline, his mind racing at 1,000,000 miles an hour. 20 minutes passed. Julian grabbed his phone and violently dialed a number. "Marcus," Julian barked the moment the call connected, ignoring the fact that it was past midnight. "Wake up the lead software architect for the supply chain division now." "Julian? What's going on? It's midnight." "I don't care if it's the dawn of the apocalypse," Julian snapped. "Tell him to run a manual override on the Savannah port registry. Check the legacy in-transit logs against physical dead storage invoices. I want a confirmation in 10 minutes. "Julian, that system hasn't been touched in 8 years. There's no way. Do it!" Julian roared, slamming the phone down. He sat back in his chair, his eyes locked on the handwritten graph on page 3. The math was flawless. The logic was elegant. It was the work of a financial savant, written with a Bic pen on the back of a legal pad. Exactly 9 minutes later, the phone buzzed. Julian snatched it up. "Speak." Marcus's voice on the other end was trembling, completely stripped of its usual corporate bravado. "Julian, my God, how did you find this?" The architect just confirmed it. "It's a ghost loop. We've been paying demurrage on over 4,000 empty containers for the last 3 years. The total loss it's over $50 million. Julian's breath hitched in his throat. He looked at the crumpled paper. "Julian? Who found this? Was it the BCG team?" Julian didn't answer. He hung up the phone. He looked at the empty room, the silence now deafening. A man he had treated like dirt. A man he had threatened to fire. A man whose life's work he had literally thrown in the trash, had just handed him the keys to a $50 million kingdom. And that man was currently walking down into the cold Manhattan night with $4 in his pocket and a starving daughter in his arms. Julian bolted out of his chair. He didn't grab his coat. He didn't grab his briefcase. He sprinted out of the executive suite, past the row of empty cubicles, and slammed his hand against the elevator button. The digital display showed the elevator descending. 30, 28, 26. Come on, Julian muttered, pacing like a caged animal. When the doors finally opened, he leaped inside and hit the button for the basement, the custodian hub. The elevator ride felt like an eternity. When the doors slid open into the concrete, fluorescent-lit underbelly of the building, Julian broke into a run. He tore through the hallways, past the boiler rooms and the industrial laundry chutes, until he reached the janitorial break room. The door was open. Inside, Arthur was standing by a locker, changing out of his gray uniform shirt into a faded flannel. Lily was sitting on a plastic chair, her small backpack already on her shoulders. Arthur turned when he heard the heavy breathing. When he saw the billionaire CEO standing in the doorway, chest heaving, suit rumpled, and eyes wide, Arthur's body went rigid. He instinctively stepped between Julian and his daughter. "Mr. Vance," Arthur said, his voice dropping into a hard, defensive tone. "We're leaving. You don't need to call security." Julian took a step forward, raising his hands in a rare gesture of complete surrender. "Arthur, wait, please." Arthur didn't move. He held his ground, his eyes hyper-focused on the man who had humiliated him less than an hour ago. Julian took a deep breath, trying to steady his racing heart. He looked at Arthur, really looked at him, not at the uniform, but at the sharp, intelligent eyes, the pride in his posture despite his circumstances, and the fierce protectiveness with which he shielded his daughter. "I ran the numbers," Julian said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Savannah port. The ghost loop. You were right. To the penny." Arthur's shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch. A look of quiet, bitter vindication crossed his face, but he didn't gloat. "I know I was right, sir." "How?" Julian asked, genuinely baffled. How does a man with your mind end up here? Arthur let out a dry, humorless chuckle. He looked down at his own worn boots. Life doesn't care about your GPA, Mr. Vance. My wife got sick, cancer. The experimental treatments weren't covered by insurance. I sold the house, liquidated my firm, took out every loan possible. When she passed, I was bankrupt, blacklisted by creditors, and I had an infant daughter to feed. This job paid cash weekly, and it allowed me to keep her with me at night because I couldn't afford childcare. You do what you have to do to survive. Julian felt a strange, unfamiliar sensation in his chest. For a man who had spent his entire life measuring worth in profit margins and stock options, he was suddenly looking at a wealth he could never buy. Absolute, unbreakable resilience. Julian looked past Arthur to Lily, who was watching him with wide, innocent eyes. "Arthur," Julian said, his voice firming up, returning to the tone of a man who commanded destiny. "I threw your report in the trash. It was the stupidest thing I've done in my entire career. I insulted you and I treated you like an invisible piece of furniture." Julian stepped closer, extending his hand. "I am offering you a formal public apology, and I want to hire you." Arthur looked at the billionaire's extended hand. He didn't take it immediately. "I already have a job, Mr. Vance. You told me I'm fired tomorrow." "Forget that," Julian said urgently. "I don't want you cleaning my office. I want you running it. I am creating a new position tomorrow morning. Director of Global Operational Integrity. You will report directly to me. Your starting salary will be $350,000 a year, with a sign-on bonus of $50,000, paid tonight, to take care of whatever immediate needs you and your daughter have." The silence in the break room was absolute. Arthur stared at Julian, his mind refusing to process the words. $350,000. It was more than he had made in the last 7 years combined. It meant a real apartment. It meant health insurance for Lily. It meant never having to check his pocket for $4.60 again. "Are you serious?" Arthur whispered, his voice cracking. "I never joke about $14 million a quarter," Julian said, a genuine, albeit small smile breaking through his stern facade. "The contract will be on my desk at 8 a.m., but right now—" Julian reached into his pocket and pulled out his black Amex card. He handed it to Arthur. "Take my driver. He's waiting out front in the Maybach. Go to the 24-hour diner uptown, get your daughter whatever she wants to eat, and go home. I'll see you at 8. In a suit." Arthur looked down at the sleek black card in his hand. He felt a tear slip down his cheek, but he quickly wiped it away, not wanting Lily to see him cry. He turned to his daughter, who was looking up at him with confusion. "Lil Bug," Arthur said, his voice thick with emotion. "Guess what?" "What, Daddy?" "We're going to get pancakes. With extra strawberries. And whipped cream." Lily's face lit up with a joy so bright it seemed to illuminate the drab concrete room. She jumped off the chair and ran into Arthur's arms. Arthur scooped her up, holding her tight. He looked over her shoulder at Julian Vance. The two men exchanged a long, silent look. It was a look of mutual respect, one born of power, the other born of survival. Arthur nodded once. "Thank you, Mr. Vance." "Thank you, Arthur," Julian replied, "for pulling my company out of the trash." As Arthur walked out of the basement, his daughter laughing in his arms and the black credit card securely in his pocket, he didn't look back at the mop buckets or the vacuums. For the first time in 10 years, Arthur Pendleton looked straight ahead, into a future that was finally beautifully clean.